The Jets need to make big upgrades on the offensive side of the ball to support whichever quarterback they draft. The good news is the team has the resources to make those big upgrades. Let's take a look at options for improving the Jets offense today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Tuesday, November 25th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. If you're new to the show, this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. Today, we are looking to the future for the New York Jets. It's going to be a very exciting offseason after we get through these final 6 games of 2025. And priority number 1 for the Jets will be figuring out the quarterback position. Priority number 2 will be supporting whichever quarterback comes in here. And on today's show, we're going to break down what the Jets need to do to build around the next quarterback of this team. We're going to talk about a very tricky decision the Jets will need to make as they build their offensive line going forward. We'll talk about one player who is a must re-sign this offseason. But let's begin by talking about the pass-catching targets on this team right now. Now, I think that most objective observers would say the Jets have a really great starting point with Garrett Wilson as their number 1 receiver. And the Jets have not always been in this position. Prior to 2022 drafting Garrett Wilson, this team has lacked a number 1 receiver for a really long time. I mean, I think between Keyshawn Johnson and Garrett Wilson, you had a couple of years with Lavernius Coles. You had the 1 year with Brandon Marshall. But for the most part, the Jets have lacked a go-to guy as a pass catcher. They have that now in Garrett Wilson. And it makes it a lot easier when you start with the number 1 receiver and you just have to fill in behind him. So the question is, what else can the Jets do? Well, you hope Mason Taylor develops as a tight end. I think looking to this offseason, the Jets may look to bring in like a different number 2 tight end. Jeremy Ruckert's going to be a free agent. Ruckert's shown some modest improvement, but he hasn't really been much of a player. I think the Jets have a lot invested in Mason Taylor. They hope he's going to develop into a quality tight end, but I don't know that Mason Taylor's ever going to be a featured part of the offense. I think Mason Taylor is going to be more of a complementary part. You'd love it if he developed into more than that, but I don't think that that's really the expectation for Mason Taylor. The question, and the big question, is how do you fill in the rest of the receiver group behind Garrett Wilson? Now, Jets have a bit of an interesting dynamic here over the final 6 games of the season because they have 2 relatively young guys they acquired in trades midseason. Adonai Mitchell from the Colts, John Metchie from the Philadelphia Eagles. And these guys have a real audition. As I said, when Garrett Wilson got injured a couple weeks back, you never wanted to see Garrett Wilson go down. But if it had to happen, this is the time where it hurts the least because, first of all, the team's not really trying to compete anyway, or the team's not really competitive anyway. And it opens up reps for 2 young guys you are trying to develop, Mitchell and Metchie. And I think that Mitchell versus Metchie has a dynamic. It very much embodies the debate in the scouting community, traits versus fundamentals. Adonai Mitchell has the traits. If he hits and John Metchie hits, Mitchell's going to be the better player. But Metchie has the fundamentals. Even though Metchie doesn't have the ceiling of a Mitchell, he's more likely to become a quality supporting player on this offense. And we've already seen that. And that Baltimore game actually really kind of played out that dynamic. Adonai Mitchell had 2 catches, one of which was kind of on a broken play where they were playing schoolyard football. Tyrod Taylor bought himself some time, got the ball to Mitchell, and Mitchell looked electric with the ball in his hands. You saw real upside on that play because Baltimore had a tough time bringing him down. Metchie, though, was the more consistent player in that game. He led the Jets with 6 catches. He was running good routes. Not a particularly dynamic playmaker, but a guy who understands the fundamentals of the position. I think that the hope is that one of these 2 guys develops into a quality depth player for the Jets going forward. Again, you'd take more, but I think if we're being realistic, these are both guys who are kind of reclamation projects. My goal for them would be for them to battle it out for maybe the number 4 receiver spot next summer in training camp. I think the Jets really should be looking at bringing in 2 wide receivers this offseason. I think that's a spot where you got to load up, especially if you're going with a young quarterback. And, the Jets are probably drafting a quarterback in 2026. And if they don't, I think it's very likely with 3 first-round picks in 2027, they will draft a quarterback then. And one of the things we've talked about through the history of this podcast, and you have to remember this podcast launched 2 years before the Jets drafted Sam Darnold. So we went through the whole Darnold era. One of the key points through the Darnold era was that the Jets did not do enough to support him. The Jets threw him out onto a team that just completely lacked talent. And they essentially asked Sam to be Patrick Mahomes. They asked him to carry the whole offense as a rookie. You don't want to do that. You want the rest of the offense to lift your quarterback up. And that means having a high-end group at the wide receiver position. So I think the Jets really should be looking at adding 2 receivers this offseason behind Garrett Wilson. I think that the hope is that Metchie and Mitchell, one of them turns into a good depth player. If you get more, that's great. But I don't want to go into 2026 having to count on either of these guys who at best is going to have like a month and a half of productive play. If Mitchell and Metchie play great down the stretch, they'll have like a month and a half of productive play on their resumes. That's not enough for a receiver I want to count on next season. So I think that, with the Jets' early picks this year, and you have to remember 2 first-round picks, 2 second-round picks, very likely one of them should go to a high-end receiver prospect. I don't want to get too deep into which prospects the Jets should draft because there's still a lot of college football left to be played. We still have rivalry weekends this Friday and Saturday. We still have championship Saturday in a week. Then we still have the postseason, the bowl games. We've got the playoff. So, I think it's a little early to be talking about which players the Jets should draft. But I think like if I was running the Jets, my goal would be draft one guy early and sign somebody in free agency. Now, of the free agents who will be available this offseason, the guy I really have my eye on is Alec Pierce from the Indianapolis Colts. And there's a lot that I like about him as a potential free agent signing. First of all, I think it's always better to get guys in their mid-20s on their second contracts than guys in their late 20s, early 30s who are on their third contracts. When you get a guy on his second contract, you're presumably getting his prime years. Another thing I look for is whether a player's on an upward trajectory. And I think it's fair to say Alex Pierce is on that. I think that's true statistically, where he's consistently improved through his 4 years in the NFL. It's also true in terms of just the film. He's become a better rounded receiver this year. I think he also adds a dimension that Garrett Wilson lacks. Garrett Wilson has a lot of skills. He's a really interesting route runner. He's a guy who can create separation easily, effortlessly changes direction. A guy who I'm not sure the Jets utilize enough in space because, Garrett Wilson may not be a guy with blazing speed, but he's a guy who can make cuts that make defenders miss. But he's not a great deep threat. Alec Pierce is a very good deep threat. So, he just checks a lot of boxes and he's in an Indianapolis receiver room where, there's a lot of depth. So they may not be as focused on keeping him. He's not really the number one guy there. He's more like the third option there. The Colts also have a bit of a tricky dilemma this offseason. What do they do with Daniel Jones? That'll probably occupy them a bit. So Pierce is a guy who could sneak through. Pierce is a guy who could be available. I think he'd be a really good signing for the Jets. And one of the things with the Jets is because they have so much cap space and they're going to enter this offseason, most accounts right now, and this is, there's going to be some maneuvers other teams make that will change their cap situation. But at the current point, the Jets are set to enter the offseason top 4 in cap space. So there's going to be resources for the Jets to spend. And when you are where the Jets are and you don't really have a lot of veteran talent, you've almost got to overspend on somebody. The question is like whether it's an egregious overspend, and whether or not you're going to get a guy who's at least going to give you some productivity. So I wouldn't have a big issue with the Jets giving Alex Pierce a decent deal. I'm not saying you make him top 5 receiver. I mean, at some point, sanity has to rule, but he'd be my top target. My secondary target, I think, would be Romeo Doubs from the Green Bay Packers. I'm not sure he's quite as good as a deep threat, but a guy who's got some good route running ability, a guy who's been moderately productive in the NFL. I think that there's a temptation to say, we'll get this guy, he'll be our number 2, or we'll count on Mitchell or Metchie to be our number 3 guy. I think you want to load up. I think that's the wide receiver spot's a position where you want to have, you want to err on the side of having too many guys, opposed to trying to bet on guys and be short there. I think that's a critical spot to help the next quarterback, and the Jets should load up there. Ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about another guy who could help a young quarterback. That's Breece Hall. And I'll be honest with you, I've gone back and forth through the season whether or not the Jets should keep Breece. I am now 100% in the camp the Jets should hold on to Breece Hall. They should make sure he remains a member of the New York Jets in 2026. And we'll discuss why as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA is back, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Even if you missed the start of the game or want to ride the hot hand, FanDuel has live bets on everything from who will score next to fourth quarter comebacks. Plus, you could even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay for a shot at a bigger payout. It keeps every game exciting, especially when your team's making that late push. And you can also get in on the NFL action on FanDuel. Looking ahead to this Sunday, Thanksgiving weekend, the Jets are hosting the Atlanta Falcons at MetLife Stadium. Falcons team is not playing very well, but still, Atlanta is a 2.5-point favorite over the Jets. I think it says a lot about the Jets season that they are home underdogs to the Atlanta Falcons. But again, if you want to get in on the action, FanDuel is the place to do it, because right now FanDuel is giving new customers $300 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. So head to FanDuel.com to sign up and play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the National Basketball Association. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day, and a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today we are focused on building up the Jets offense. There are 6 games left in the season. It is an audition for a number of players to have a role on this team going forward, but you should make no mistake about it. This New York Jets offense needs upgrades personnel-wise, but they also need to make sure they keep the talent that they have. Breece Hall, who I think is having a really good season, is set to be a free agent. And through the summer, through the early points of the season, you heard me go back and forth on whether or not the Jets should keep Breece. I was kind of fence sitting, which is not really my nature, but Breece was making it really hard. He'd have one good week to start the season against Pittsburgh, then he'd have a bad game where he didn't look like he was really able to get much going. But I've really settled on the idea that the Jets should keep Breece Hall. And there are 2 big reasons behind that. First of all, again, it's the season he's having. Entering this year, it's a bit unclear what sort of running back Breece Hall was. His rookie season, before he got injured, he looked dominant. Year 2, year 3, you saw flashes, but you also saw weeks where he didn't do a whole lot. I think that having gotten the opportunity to watch Breece this year, you see where his real strengths, you see where his real weaknesses are. And, he's a playmaker. He's a guy who can make splash plays. You get him into space, you get him on outside, you get him running sweeps. Sometimes, even if you get him downhill, he can be tough to bring down because he's a pretty big back. Sometimes, though, he hesitates. He doesn't always read his blocks all that well. And to me, that makes him like a really high-end tandem back, where he's like a really high-end 1A in a duo. So I think that a lot of the focus this offseason should be on finding Breece the right partner, finding a guy who's a good complement to Breece. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But the second reason I think the Jets should keep Breece is the Sauce Gardner and Quinnen Williams trades changed everything about the way this team is building. Before those deals, it felt like the Jets were building around a core of players in their prime. Quinnen Williams, Sauce Gardner, Garrett Wilson. Now Garrett Wilson's really the only one of those guys who's left, and Garrett Wilson's really the only big money veteran the Jets have left. This is a team that has gone super young. They're going to continue to load up around draft picks who are inexpensive. They're going to have a lot of cap space, and that cap space is going to have to go towards veteran players. And one of the things I kind of alluded to this in the first segment that should dictate the Jets' strategy is when you have a lot of cap space and you have a lot of young players, and you don't have many veterans, you're going to have to pay guys big money. And it's not always going to be the most efficient form of spending. The question is whether it's the type of deal where, even though you're overpaying, you're happy with the production, you're at least getting something from him, or whether it's just going to be a totally bad deal. So you have to try and find the overpays that actually help your team. And I think that Breece Hall, even if you overpay him, he's a guy who's going to be very helpful to a young quarterback. One of the things I always focus on is how many big plays do you need to win a game? And you want to force your young quarterback to make as few of those big plays as possible. It's really easy on a young quarterback when he can just hand the ball off to a back and you can rip off a 20-yard run there. That's one less time the young quarterback needs to stand in the pocket, scan the entire field, and deliver an accurate pass. When you can just throw a screen to Breece Hall, it's easy. If you're a young quarterback, you're back in the pocket. You're looking, should I try that tight window throw? Well, that's risky. I could just dump it off to Breece Hall, and my check down could turn into a big play. These are the types of considerations you need to make when you're building your team around a future quarterback. I think that Breece is a guy who will really be helpful to that next quarterback. And the other thing I'd throw out there is you'd like to see a front office that has a coherent strategy. The Jets held on to Breece Hall at the trade deadline when they could have dealt him. Most reports suggest they could have gotten a 4th-round pick for him. You should not turn down a 4th-round pick for a player who's going to leave anyway. And the Jets are almost certainly not going to be in the compensatory pick mix this year. NFL has this formula called compensatory picks, where if you lose more than you gain in free agency, you get bonus draft picks. Jets are not going to be in that mix because they have a lot of holes across their roster, and they're going to have a lot of cap space this offseason. So that's not a consideration. If Breece Hall was not going to return next year, the Jets should have traded him. They could have had an extra 4th-round pick. It's a bad decision if Breece Hall leaves. If the Jets are going to keep Breece Hall, though, and the Jets view Breece Hall as a critical component of developing their next quarterback, well, then it's a good decision. 4th-round pick is not worth losing a weapon like Breece Hall. So, the franchise tag is expensive, but it is kind of like the backup plan for the Jets. And in the ideal world, they'd be able to get Breece under contract on a more reasonable number than the franchise tag. But I think that Breece has a lot of leverage right now. And Breece should have a lot of leverage. And I don't want to go crazy. I don't want to pay like Breece Hall, Saquon Barkley money. But I think it would make a lot of sense for the New York Jets to sign Breece Hall to a multi-year contract this offseason. And I think then after that, the goal is find a back who can fill in the gaps for what Breece's weaknesses are. And I think that that's mainly kind of zone runs on the inside, running between the tackles. The question is whether you have that guy internally. Braylon Allen's shown some flashes that he might be that guy, but, we haven't seen Allen do it consistently. And I think based on what we've seen, it's possible he might be more suited as a number 2 back. What can Isaiah Davis do? I mean, they got to change the way they deploy Isaiah Davis. Isaiah Davis should not be a 3rd-down back for this team. Isaiah Davis should be replacing Breece on some of the early downs when Breece needs a rest and you want to run inside. I think they have completely messed up the way they're utilizing these running backs. I don't really understand why Breece Hall is coming off the field on 3rd downs, but that's another matter. So the question is, you have these final 6 games, and you can definitely evaluate whether Davis potentially could be in the mix as a tandem back for Breece. You could also look to the NFL draft. I'm a big believer that you try and get running backs young. You try and get them when they don't have miles on the odometer. Running back is a position. I don't want to say it's easy to find a running back because it's not easy to find anything in the NFL. But relatively speaking, it's easier to find a good running back than it is a good wide receiver. There are more good running backs available later on in the later stages of the draft, round 2 and 3, than there are wide receivers. And sometimes you get even get into round 4 and you can find a really good running back prospect. So I think that clearly the Jets should try and keep Breece Hall, and I think most of the focus should be on finding a tandem back with him, whether he's on the team or whether he's not, who complements him. And that's a tough inside runner. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about the Jets offensive line. And to be honest with you, there are things to like about this offensive line, particularly the young tackles. The dilemma for the Jets this offseason will be on the interior, because Jets have a number of guys about to hit free agency, and a lot of them have question marks. We'll talk about some of the big decisions for the Jets on the interior of the offensive line as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets.
Today's show is brought to you by our friends over there at Peloton. Look, folks, it's time to break through the busiest time of the year with a brand new Peloton cross-training Tread Plus that's powered by Peloton IQ. It's Peloton's most elevated technology and equipment yet that gives you real-time guidance, and it gives you endless ways to move, whether you want to work out by yourself or if you want to work out with your favorite instructor, like my personal favorite, Alex Toussaint. He always gets me fired up to tackle the day. And the thing I like about Peloton, it helps me achieve more in less times. They have features that help you plan, stay motivated, track your progress, and Peloton IQ also provides personalized workout plans and recommendations. That's something that I use right now during the busiest time of the year covering the NFL. They plan my workouts for me based on my mood, my vibe, and also my favorite instructors. So make sure you check it out and use it, because it also helps you correct your form in real time, and it maximizes your reps. It counts your reps so that you can do it smarter, safer, and more efficient. Let yourself run, lift, flex, push, and go. Explore the new Peloton cross-training Tread Plus at onepeloton.com.
This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Tuesday. On today's show, we're looking ahead to the offseason and talking about what the Jets need to do to build an offense around their future rookie quarterback, because it's very likely the Jets will draft a quarterback either in the NFL draft in 2026 or in 2027. Jets are loaded with high draft picks, and they need a quarterback. But of course, helping a quarterback succeed means building the right offense around him. And we've talked about what the Jets need to do at the wide receiver position around Garrett Wilson today. We've talked about how essential it is not only to keep Breece Hall, but to find Breece Hall, a tandem back who complements his style. Now let's talk about the offensive line. And I can bring you some good news on the offensive line. I think it's fair to say that with each passing week, it looks more and more likely that the Jets have figured out the tackle position for the foreseeable future. Armand Membou has been having an excellent rookie season. In fact, I've even started to see some rookie of the year buzz for Membou, which would be really interesting to see a tackle actually get some love in these awards. I'd be behind that push because I think that these awards are too focused on the skill positions. Let's give the offensive linemen some love. So Armand Membou is having an excellent rookie season. Fashanu has been up and down through the season, but the highs have been really high, and they've become more frequent. And you have to remember that offensive tackle is a spot where it can be a multi-year developmental curve. Fashanu is starting to play really solid football. I think at this point, I'm almost ready to say that Fashanu seems like an average left tackle. And he's still got room to grow because he's still in year 2, and he didn't play a whole lot in year 1. So there's real opportunity for Fashanu to become an upper echelon left tackle. And Armand Membou, I mean, he's almost, I think it's fair to say at this point, he's an above average right tackle. So the 2 tackle spots, which are the toughest spots to fill on the offensive line, I want to be cautious here. I don't want to make preliminary declarations, but there's a lot to be optimistic about with the tackle spots. And that's a huge relief when you got a young quarterback. If you can be confident in both of your tackles, those are huge boxes to check off when you're trying to build an offense around a young quarterback. The questions for the Jets are on the interior of the offensive line. And I think going forward, nothing's really settled there. There's one player we know who's going to be in the mix, but we don't know where he's going to play because Joe Tippmann has, of course, moved between guard and center through most of his career. He started at guard a few years ago as a rookie when Jets suffered some injuries there. He then moved inside after Connor McGovern got injured in 2023. Developed into a good center in 2024. Well, 2025 comes. Alijah Vera-Tucker gets injured before the first game. Tippmann shifts to right guard. Of course, Josh Meyer steps into the starting lineup at center. And Tippmann's play had been uneven in the early part of the season. He's really stabilized it, though. I think the last 6 weeks or so, you've seen Tippmann grow into a high-end guard. And when something like this happens, I think the question is always, is this just randomness? Because, sometimes a guy just has a good streak. It doesn't really mean anything. Or is there a reason that Tippmann's play has improved? And I don't think it's that hard to figure out a theory behind Tippmann's play improving being for real. I think we could come up with a pretty compelling story to explain that. You have to remember, Tippmann spent the entire training camp and preseason at center. I know he did play a little guard in the preseason opener against Green Bay because John Simpson was injured. But the Jets had him play center through the bulk of the preseason, through the bulk of training camp. And then a few days before the regular season starts, Tippmann has to move to guard. Would it be natural for there to be an adjustment period? And I would say yes. Is it a coincidence that adjustment period seemed to last about as long as a typical NFL training camp does? I think that's a compelling point. And I think in today's NFL, if you have a guy who can play guard and who can play center, guard is more valuable. This is not the NFL of 25 years ago, where the Jets had Kevin Mawai at center, because in the NFL those days, the dominant defense was the 3-4. And the 3-4 defense was based around a big nose tackle, a guy who was like 330, 340, 350 pounds, who lined up directly over the center. And that guy just wrecked the game. And the center had to be able to block him one-on-one. In today's NFL, it's very rare that a guy lines up directly over the center. More often, they're lined up over the guards, and the center is really just kind of helping provide a double team. The center's roles are really make the line calls, make sure everyone's blocked up correctly, make sure everyone's got the right assignment, snap the football, and provide help. And the thing with Tippmann is like one of his weakest parts at center is snapping the ball. He's been kind of an inconsistent snapper, especially in shotgun. But he's got blocking skills. And blocking one-on-one is a critical component for an offensive lineman. And he's going to get more opportunities to block one-on-one at guard. The other aspect of this is that it is easier to find a center than it is a guard in today's NFL for the reasons that I mentioned. Now, you don't want a disaster at center. I mean, I spent many of the early years on this show complaining about the Jets center position because we had Wesley Johnson one year, Spencer Long, which was a disaster signing from Washington in 2018, Jonathan Harrison. The Jets signed Ryan Khalil off the couch in 2019. He was never in game shape. I mean, those, if you have a really bad center, it can destroy an offense. But if you have a guy who's like, okay, your offense can function. I mean, Josh Myers is not a star by any stretch of the imagination, but he's a decent enough player. The question this offseason will be whether the Jets make a big move at center. And there is an elite center who is, at least right now, in line to be available, and that is Tyler Linderbaum of the Baltimore Ravens, a name you may remember because he was kind of in the mix for the Jets back in 2022 when he was a draft prospect. He was a guy who was mentioned pretty frequently, and that was a year, of course, where the Jets had a lot of early picks, just as they do in 2026. Linderbaum has developed into a star player, and if you're going to bring in a rookie quarterback, there could be a logic to spending big at center, because we just discussed what the roles of the center are. And one of the big ones is making sure the line has the correct assignments blocking, making sure that there's no unaccounted for pass rusher, making sure that the run assignments are correct, making sure that, you're set up for success. Usually those are duties split between a quarterback and the center. And when you're bringing in a rookie quarterback, the responsibilities almost always shift directly to the center. So it could make sense for the Jets to spend big at center this offseason with Tyler Linderbaum. It'll be interesting to see how much he wants. Of course, with every player, there's a price where it makes sense and a price where it doesn't. But that could be a splurge spot for the Jets this offseason where they have a lot of resources. But they're going to need to sign 2 interior offensive linemen this year because Joe Tippmann's the only current starter who is under contract for 2026. John Simpson's set to be a free agent. Josh Myers is set to be a free agent. And Alijah Vera-Tucker set to be a free agent. And if you look at the options available for the New York Jets right now at the guard position, there really are not many. And I'm going to say something that will be unpopular with a large portion of the fan base, but I think it's accurate. I don't see a lot of guards available on the open market who are better than Alijah Vera-Tucker. Now, I'm not saying you give AVT a big contract right now, but what I will say is triceps injuries tend not to be chronic things. And you may say, well, he suffered 2. Well, he suffered 1 on each arm. Is it a case where maybe, I don't know, is AVT more susceptible to injuries than other guys? Perhaps, but there's not really any data right now that suggests triceps injuries are a chronic thing. All the data that I've seen suggests that they're kind of just random, and it's just ridiculously unlucky that AVT got injured. I think that you're going to have a tough time finding somebody who's a better guard than AVT available on the open market. So I think the move for the Jets might be, and again, I know this is going to be unpopular, but I think the move for the Jets might be signing AVT to an incentive-laden deal, and the incentives will be based on playing time. Yes, you're going to need to make sure that you have quality depth behind him. Certainly, I think that there has to be a backup plan, and maybe that means drafting a guard relatively early. That was one of the issues I had with the Jets draft in 2025 is that they did not draft an offensive lineman in the mid rounds. They picked Armand Membou in the first round, which was a good move. But good team building practices, try and draft an offensive lineman in the mid to late rounds as a developmental player, someone with tools that you can try and develop. I'm not saying the Jets can depend on AVT to play 17 games, and you also might want to look for a higher end backup who's available on the open market as a free agent. But I mean, look at the list of free agents to be at the offensive guard position this offseason. I don't think you're going to find many better than AVT. So that might be the move for the Jets. And it's something we'll discuss a lot going forward in the days, weeks, and months ahead on this podcast. But that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening to let you never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Tuesday, everybody, and send in your mailbag questions. Tomorrow we'll do our weekly mailbag. I can't wait to answer your questions. Talk to you then.